Combining the best of daily fantasy and survivor pools, Stat Hero is the next chapter in fantasy sports. No more competing with the sharks or experts ever, because your only competition is Stat Hero itself. The face of DFS has changed. Finally, a game designed for the rest of us.
Hey, what's going on? Jeff Ratcliffe here. Week 10's in the book, so it's time for the Week 11 Fantasy Football Waiver Wire. And before we dive into this week's top ads, it's important to note this is the time of year where you really want to stockpile your bench. If you're making a push for the playoffs, you want to load up a talent, especially at the running back position. And I know your waiver wire might be picked clean. Pick it cleaner. Get the deepest possible guys you can get in there because you never know what injury might impact the fantasy football landscape. Also, load up at wide receivers. You don't need a backup at quarterback. You don't need to carry multiple tight ends, multiple defenses because, hey, you only start one of those in most leagues, whereas you're starting 5 or 6 running backs and wide receivers every single week. It's more important to have depth there, so keep that in mind as you're making those waiver claims tonight. But let's dive into that quarterback position because, hey, you may be in the market for one, and one is returning this week. Nick Foles is back. It looked like he was going to be Wally pipped for a minute there by Gardner Minshew, but the rookie is going back to the bench, and Nick Foles is getting back out there. And, hey, here's what we saw. We saw what Gardner Minshew could do with that surrounding talent in Jacksonville. There's a lot of, these are interesting receivers with a lot of speed. And we saw, hey, Nick Foles in the past has been a fantasy asset, of course, going back to last season. Didn't have a lot of starts, but over those last 3 weeks of the regular season, he was a top 10 fantasy quarterback. He was the number 7 there. It's a small sample size, but we at least know the ceiling is there with Nick Foles, so you could see him becoming a viable regular fantasy starter going forward here, potential QB2 with QB1 upside. He's worth a look this week. Going over to the running back position, and man, injuries create opportunities in fantasy. It stinks when injuries happen, but we have to be prepared and we have to pounce when we have that opportunity. So in this case, I'm talking about Brian Hill. Devontae Freeman banged up with a foot injury. Ito Smith on injured reserve. So Brian Hill is the next man up, and we saw him with 21 touches this past week. Now, it was not an efficient day for Brian Hill, but the volume is there because when you look down that depth chart, there's nobody else on the roster. You know, you have Kenyon Barner, who's more of a special teams guy than he is a backup running back. You have Quadri Olison, who's a plotter, he's a rookie on this roster. There's a ton of opportunity for touches here for Brian Hill over the next couple weeks. Keep in mind, this isn't a guy who's very likely going to win you your league, but he might win you a matchup or two over the next couple weeks. He's a fantasy rental because I do expect Freeman to come back. So don't go overboard in terms of fab spending for Hill, but he is certainly one of the top pickups of the week. Moving over to wide receiver now, the Giants are heading into bye, but that doesn't mean we should overlook Darius Slayton. Last week, 10 catches, 14 targets, goes up over 100 receiving yards, and of course another double touchdown game out of Darius Slayton. One of the mistakes I see a lot of people make when it comes to waiver pickups is they sort by projected points, and then they pick up the guys who are projected to score the most points. You know, that's great, except the teams on bye don't factor in there. So don't do that this week, and certainly don't overlook Darius Slayton. If he's out there on waivers, he does need to be picked up. Finally, let's go to tight end. And I'll tell you, I don't say it very often, but you heard it here. I was wrong. I was wrong about Jacob Hollister. Hey, I didn't think this was going to be more than a 1-week blip. It wasn't. And I did the same thing with Will Dissly. So the moral of the story, first and foremost, I was wrong about Hollister and Dissly, but the Seahawks really like those tight ends. Jacob Hollister, over the last 2 weeks, has been awesome. 3 receiving touchdowns, so he's been a fantasy monster. He's close to 100 yards receiving over that span. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's decent for a tight end. He's up over double-digit catches as well. This is a nice little stretch for him, and it shows that he's going to keep being used. Now, again, we have another situation with a bye week coming here, but you do want to scoop him up because for the rest of the season, Jacob Hollister is a tight end 1. He's a guy we're going to be starting every single week. Now, I realize these guys might already be owned in your league, but we have you covered. Every week in my waiver wire column, I give you over 40 recommendations. We go from shallow to deep leagues. And if you have free agent bidding in your league, fab bidding, then we have you covered there too. I give you recommendations of how much of your budget you should spend on these guys. That's every Tuesday in my waiver wire column. We have that, we have rankings, we have projections, and we have all kinds of football goodness over at PFF.com.
Thanks for watching the PFF YouTube channel. And if you want to subscribe, all you have to do is push the button. Don't forget everything you get. A little fantasy, push the button. A little green line for the gambling aspects of the game, push the button. College football, push the button. The YouTube channel from PFF.